Well, hello, and welcome everyone to this episode of Word Equity Speech Stories. I am your host, Dominique Kennedy, and I am so excited to bring this particular topic to you today. If you have not already had an opportunity to meet our special guest, if you have not seen her yet in some of the platforms that she's been featured on, you may recognize her as one of the reviewers for my book, Reconciliation Through Conversation. But I am super excited to invite our special guest today, Makini Austin. Let's welcome her into the studio. How you doing, Makini?
I am well, Dominique. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. I'm so glad you're here this morning. Tell us, Makini, a little bit about you. Tell us what you would like the audience to know more about.
Sure. So, as Dominique said, Makini Austin. I am a licensed professional counselor here in Atlanta, Georgia. And in my career, I've held a variety of roles or worked in a variety of settings in mental health. Most currently, I have a small private practice, and I am the director of counseling at Agnes Scott College. Higher ed is one of the areas that I really enjoy working in, as well as with families and couples and doing individual counseling. And so I am so excited to be here today to have this conversation about words and communication and how important they can be in our relationships.
Absolutely. It's so awesome to have you here with us this morning. Thank you for sharing that information. I know you have quite an extensive background in your clinical practice and just your area of expertise. So I'm excited for the audience to get a chance to experience this conversation and this discussion about mental health and how we can approach the language around it. So one of my first questions, Makini, have you seen like a correlation between how we communicate with one another and how that relates to perhaps our personal life, our professional life, how things show up differently based on our communication in those arenas?
Absolutely. It's interesting because one of the things that when we think about communication, we think about like what we're actually saying and what's coming out of our mouth. A lot of times that conversation starts in our head before it even comes out of our mouth. And so in thinking about how that impacts our relationships, one of the things I often encourage people to think about is what is that story they're creating in their head? What is that communication they're having with themselves? And then that definitely then impacts how we're showing up with others. So the story and the meaning that we assign to other people's actions, behavior, everything then impacts how we're going to interact with that person.
Absolutely. I love that you placed emphasis on that self-talk, that conversation that we have in our own minds, and how that does contribute to how we interact with others, maybe how we show up with others, the perceptions that we have of what is happening in the conversation, both personally, again, and professionally. Oftentimes we may think about, certain patterns that happen within the conversation when we have certain relationships, or perhaps even on the job, you may be thinking and wondering about how you're entering a space and how that contributes to how you're elevating professionally. But in my perspective, my personal perspective is that how we show up in conversation directly correlates and contributes to those particular areas. So thank you for bringing that up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I often encourage people to think about, because one of the things to consider is we have to take part of the responsibility for the meaning that we assign to other people's behavior, actions, they're even what they're saying. Oftentimes the content of what someone's saying is not the only thing to pay attention to. Tone, volume, and how you say things is also important. Again, we have to take some of the responsibility, though, to the meaning that we assign. And so that's paying attention to, again, that conversation we're having with ourselves. What are the thoughts we're having? What are we thinking about ourselves? What are we thinking about others? And a lot of that is us. We bring that to the table. We bring a lot. I often ask people when they are sharing a story or telling me about something that happened at work in their personal lives, and they start to tell me what the other person meant or what was happening. And I'll always say, how do you know?
Right.
And they'll say, well, and it's usually not based on any fact or evidence. right? The phrase I'll frequently use, they'll say, well, she felt like this or she thought that. And I say, as evidenced by what?
Wow.
And then they'll think about it, and everything that they're sharing is a meaning that they assign to it. Everything that they're saying. And then what I'm prompting at that point is, so how could you get a better understanding to be sure? And there's a very simple answer. You can ask.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Asking questions brings about or provokes opportunities to gain understanding. Again, I mentioned the book Reconciliation Through Conversation, but in that book, it is chock full of just questions to consider as you are sitting, walking through, navigating a particular conversation. So I do have a question about that. So you may find that someone may consider, at least in their own perspective or from their own perspective, well, if you knew my story, then you would understand this. Or because this person knows my story, that then they should understand that. Like, what would you say to those who assign, and you talked about accountability, assigning, thinking that a person should automatically understand where you're coming from, automatically understand your intentions, just because they know your story, or if they knew your story, then they would better understand. How do you help people to gain more perspective and insight as to how to qualify that kind of statement?
Again, it's by, that conversation or that communication, but the expectation that someone see the world through your lens is the expectation that they'll see it through your lens and then experience it the same way that you do.
Wow.
Even if you shared your story with them, they might not have the same takeaway or understand what your experience is. They can have the same experience that you have. You can bond and say, oh, that's happened to me also, yet I experience it differently. And so I often share that with folks and say, is that a realistic expectation that everyone else sees situations, see the world the same way that you do?
Wow.
Right? Because that goes both ways. Because then that means that they should see it the way you do, or you should see it the way they do. And so I'm a big proponent of, that's where that communication is so key, is to share that. I often hear people in the same vein. A frequent phrase I'll hear people say is, well, they should have just known, or they should have just done that. If they wanted to do it, they would have done it.
Wow.
And then I will follow up with, the measure is not if you have to ask. The measure is, if you ask, will the person try to meet your need? We're not mind readers.
Exactly.
And so we understand a person's needs, wants, desires, because they communicate them to us. That is how we understand them. And Absolutely. So that requires a level of vulnerability, because if I express my needs and they aren't met, that can feel like rejection. That can feel like any number of things. And so that part requires that vulnerability to put yourself out there and say, hey, this is what my need is. Or this is what I'm thinking, right? Even expecting someone to just think, know what you're thinking and respond to that, or even how to respond to something.
Right.
So frequently we share something with someone, whether it's an experience, past, present, and we have this expectation that they're going to respond a certain way. And how often have any of us been in that position where someone's sharing something and we don't know how to respond? It's like, what do they need in the moment? Loss is a big one. I frequently hear people that sit across from me, and I hear a spectrum of, I hate when people keep asking me if I'm okay. And another person might say, no one's even asked me if I'm okay. And so that's just an example of, people have different experiences and have different needs as it relates to those experiences. And the way that you figure out either how to meet someone's needs or how to get your needs met is by communicating, is by saying whatever, like, how can I support you? Or on the other side, this is how you can support me, or this is what I need in that moment.
Absolutely. I love that you brought out the language piece, not knowing what to say in a situation, not quite having an opportunity to really having had that experience before. So maybe you don't always know what to say it, how to present that particular question. But I love that you brought out the fact that, prompting a question, asking how I can support you, thinking deeply about what you would expect. And we're thinking about expectations. What would you expect from someone in this particular circumstance or under that particular circumstance? So kind of thinking deeply about what that would look like for you individually. And as a person, maybe being on the other side, considering if I don't know what to say, if I'm not sure of the specific language, I can ask a question. What can I do to support you? Kind of having those broader terms. Are there some other key phrases that you offer to clients or share with people that you work with to help them facilitate that conversation?
I definitely encourage people to be honest about what their experience is. And so what you just mentioned, in a moment, being able to say to someone, wow, I'm not sure how to respond.
Yes.
And I want to be supportive. So I'm open to whatever needs to happen. Right. And what that requires is, and I say, this is one of the things I try to teach people, is how do you sit in what your experience is and then communicate that? Often when I'm working with folks, I might start putting language to what I hear them saying. And so based on what I know about this person, based on an experience that they're sharing and how I hear what's going on, I start putting words to it. And it's always funny because sometimes people will actually get pen and paper. They'll be like, hold on, I want to write that down. Say that again because I won't remember. And one of the things I'll say to them is that I'm not making this up. I'm reflecting what I hear you saying. And so if I can teach you how to sit in your experience, then you'll be able to do the same thing I'm doing. I'm putting language to what you're reflecting to me. This is not me coming up with some great answer because you were like asking me the answer to a test question and this is the answer. I'm listening to what you're saying and I am reflecting your experience. That is what I'm reflecting. And so teaching people how to do that, to pause, help me understand listen to what you're saying. What you said what I heard you say was someone shared something with you and you didn't know how to respond to it. Express I don't know. I'm not sure how to help in this moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's such a key point. I love that you brought up some things that were, seemingly simple, but very powerful. So that pause factor, taking the opportunity to be reflective, really take the time to sit and be reflective, taking the time to pause in conversation. Sometimes we feel like it's an unnatural place or unnatural thing to do, to simply take a moment, quiet moment, maybe in the midst of even having a conversation and just pause and think about how you would like to move forward. It's okay. And I tell my clients, especially my clients who are people who stutter, or even outside of that arena, just those who want to find the language, want to show up in a different way, taking time to pause. I share with them, people will wait for you. You're teaching them how to converse with you. You're teaching them how to be patient in the moments with you while you ponder what you would like to say next, how you would like to communicate next. And I think that gives an opportunity for us to not just say something just because you think it fits, or say something because we feel like that's what the person wants to hear. Really thinking about, how do I feel about the information that was shared with me, and how would I like to respond? It is so okay to give yourself a chance to pause and reflect. I love that you shared that piece. And the other thing I love that you shared, Makini, is that, it's not about saying it this way or that way. In my most recent book, The Word Equity Model, I talk about this defined way in which we show up from a place of intentionality. It does have a particular look. There is a model for it, but the language that is going to be used from one person to the next is going to be very specific and authentic to that individual. So while it's great to be able to jot down, okay, this is what you said, let me write that down, it still has to be able to be fashioned in a way that it sounds like the way you would communicate it as an individual, sounds like what would fit for that particular conversation, and how that person can best receive it. You don't really know how someone's going to receive something. You can only share from your own perspective, your own vantage point, and be open to how you can continue and navigate that dialogue. You know,
Yes.
that's definitely something I love that you shared there. And then I wanted to find out too, okay, so we're thinking about conversation, thinking about communication. There's oftentimes opportunity to navigate positively, but there are going to be those times where miscommunication comes up. So I wanted to find out during times that there may be a frequency of miscommunication, frequency of communication breakdown, just misunderstanding in dialogue. What is something that you would encourage people to do in order to confront those situations, how to navigate those situations differently, so it's not the same situation happening over and over in the same way?
Well, one is I would identify the pattern. You know, it feels like we keep finding ourselves back here, or it seems like we keep having the same disagreement. It feels like we keep having the same. So I'm going to identify it first. Identify what and identify what my experience is, right? I'm feeling like this keeps happening, right? And this is that place where words can be important, right? That we call those I statements. I'm feeling like, I think, because when you make a declarative statement, we keep having miscommunication. You're stating something as a fact. That person might not agree. No, we don't. Right? When it says, I feel like we keep having miscommunication, what are they going to say? You don't feel like that, right? Different words, different language.
Right.
Or I think we keep having miscommunication. I think we keep having a breakdown. They're going to, again, will they tell you, but no, you don't think that, right? And so I statements become very important because you're taking ownership that this is my experience of what is happening. It doesn't mean it is what's happening. It means it's my experience of it. And then what I'm going to share is, and I would like to have a different experience, right? And I'm going to communicate the experience I would like to have. I would like to see us be able to come to agreements more easily. I would like to see us and start talking through how that happens. Right. And again, this is where language becomes important. I am an advocate of focusing on what you want to happen, what you want to invite in, as opposed to, I don't want us to keep doing this. I don't want us to keep doing that, because you're not then speaking in what's the direction we're going in. Right. Wow. And so how do we speak and how do we talk about, and this is in all facets. What is it that you want to see happen? What is it that you want to encourage versus what you're trying to prevent? I don't want this to happen. I want to prevent this from happening, because inevitably what you focus on is the thing that is going to come to fruition most times. So if you're focused on what you don't want to happen, a lot of times that's what's going to end up happening. Sometimes just in a different way than the way that you thought you prevented it, because that's where you're focused. You're focused in that area. You focus on what you would like to encourage, right? The other thing is that when you say, I don't want this to happen, well, then there's a whole list of other things that could happen that are also unfavorable.
Wow.
Right? So if you're focusing on what you would like to happen, you're narrowing down. You're saying, hey, can we move in this direction versus can we not move in this direction? You know, I use the example. I always use food examples. That's like when somebody says, what would you like to eat? Well, I don't want pizza.
Well,
so, okay. Well, we can have, but there's so many other things you can have. Right. And none of those are what you want either, versus I would like to have something healthy. I would like to have something light. I would like to have, I'm super hungry. I want a big meal. I want something different, exotic, tasty. It's very different from saying what you don't want.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Makini, I love everything that you shared just there. Just in that moment, it's packed full of so many amazing nuggets. And the things that I took out the most were being able to communicate your experience and also use language to communicate the direction as to where you would like to see things to go. Because we can spend a lot of time on rehashing things or re-evaluating what actually already happened, while there may be value in making sure everyone's on the same page as to not just the outcomes, the experience itself, the events themselves, but communicating your own experience and being accountable for that. And then also making sure you use language to help identify where you want to go. I think that's so key. I think that is something that can be applied in so many different arenas. As a speech language pathologist, we work with individuals on social language, pragmatics, just that area in which we think about how we exchange, how we interact from human to human. So a lot of those particular factors are embedded in that, but there's so many other pieces that we even covered today, just the body language that is used, the word choice, being able to understand both the perspective of both communicators is so key. So I brought those things up, Makini. And you know what, I wanted to take a moment in this time to make sure I acknowledge the audience. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Thank you for those who will join us in an opportunity to take advantage of the replay, jumping onto the different platforms, onto word-equity.com and visiting the broadcast opportunity there and jumping back here onto the live. I wanted to make sure I acknowledge Ms. Lisa Cross, who's joining us this morning. She has a question, and you guys feel free to comment, to drop in questions. We definitely want to hear from you. We want your questions to get answered. And before Makini and I exit today, we will definitely make sure you have an opportunity to reach her so you can take advantage of her stellar services. But the question from Lisa is it wrong to prevent conflict by bypassing conversation? So you're the expert. I have my opinion about it too, but I'll pass it over to you if you don't mind. Is it wrong to prevent conflict by bypassing conversation?
So first, I do not subscribe to the notion of right and wrong, because who gets to decide what is right and wrong? I typically ask people to help me understand what their goal is, right? So it's like, is it wrong for me to do this? Well, help me understand what you're trying to do, and we can identify if that is going to get you there. So, and conflict. So my theory on conflict is the only bad conflict is unresolved conflict. And so if you are avoiding it, then you're not likely going to get your needs met, and it's likely going to resurface again. And so back to, is it right or wrong? If your goal is to, resolve the conflict, if your goal is to be in a better place in that relationship, then avoiding the conflict is not going to get you there. If it is a relationship that doesn't have a lot of value to you, if it is a relationship that's a one-off and you never have to see this person again, then that might not be a bad option, is avoiding whatever the conflict is in that moment so that you can get through the moment. But in relationships that you value, and it's likely going to show up again if you're avoiding it. And typically it's going to fester. And when it finally does show up, it's going to show up at a point where it's more explosive and more difficult to navigate.
Yeah, I can agree with that, certainly. And one of the things I like to, if I may add to what you shared, I'm wondering if the avoidance is, if it's even beneficial, as you talked about. Is it really being avoided in the sense that it's not going away, essentially? So it's not going away. It's still something present. And in doing so, how does that contribute to, how does that shape the ongoing aspect of that particular relationship? So I do have questions about that. And then I would even encourage, going back to the language piece of it, perhaps presenting questions like, so I'm wondering your thoughts on this, or I'm noticing that, or I heard you say this, is that accurate? So being able to kind of present things so that you're not necessarily pointing fingers or placing blame, but asking questions so that you can get further clarity as to what, again, going back to what that person's experience is, and gaining understanding so that you can better navigate the approach of even having the conversation. So I don't know if that added anything extra to what you shared, and if there's anything else you wanted to add to that particular question.
No, I think that was spot on, Dominique. Spot on.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Lisa, for adding that question in there. And again, audience, feel free to drop in some questions. We definitely want to hear from you. We definitely want to make sure, as we navigate this conversation on, giving language, assigning words to feelings, and how to better communicate those feelings in conversation, we want to make sure we address those things. So I wanted to ask about opportunities to open up the lines of communication. So perhaps there's a conversation you have been avoiding. Maybe there's a situation that has been more pressing that you're not particularly thrilled about approaching. Maybe it's been an ongoing dialogue and some people just get exhausted by the conversation itself. I wondered if you have any ways in which you can encourage people to approach that particular situation, particularly as it relates to how one can just open up the lines of communication itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say, particularly if it's something that you visited before, if it's a conversation that has been had, I'm just always a fan of addressing those pieces, as when you circle back saying, I know this is something we've talked about before. I had some new thoughts. Mm-hmm. I have some things that I feel like I wasn't able to fully express when we discussed it last time, and stating that idea of what is my goal here, mm-hmm. right? What is my intention? I'm circling back because I feel like we can unpack this some more, whatever, and drilling down whatever that means in that situation, with the goal of what I would like is for us to be able to fill in the blank, so that you're being clear about what your goals are,
right,
and why you are revisiting it. And oftentimes people are just unclear, and that kind of goes back to what we were first talking about, is that people are assigning their meaning to it. Mm-hmm. And so if you're clear about what you're saying and what your intentions are, I think about that when I say to people, well, this is what they were thinking, feeling, doing. And if I were to say, as evidenced by what, wow, they could say, well, because she told me, right? So just be clear that if you're telling people, hey, this is what my goal is, this is what I'm trying to accomplish and what I'm trying to do, that then it's clear as we're navigating through this. And we can have a whole nother conversation about, is that if someone tells you what they're doing, yet you are not trusting that, trust is a whole nother conversation, right? Absolutely. Because then that's when you have to pay attention to, if someone's being clear and communicating with me what their intentions are, why they're approaching something, what they're trying to do in this conversation, yet I don't trust that that's what's going on, or I still assign different meaning to it, right? That's something you got to pay attention to. Is Absolutely. There something in this relationship that's making me feel like, I can't trust this, or is that my stuff?
Absolutely. I love that. And then I had one way I want to segment, but I wanted to make sure I answered. Roslyn joined the conversation this morning, wanted to answer her question. So Roslyn posed the question, is there a best time to communicate a situation? Should it be done right away or later? When may it be received better? So when's the best? So timing of how to approach a conversation sounds like it's her question.
Yeah. A couple of layers to that, right? So depending on what is going on in the current situation, if it is because sometimes situations are at a place where they feel volatile, or it's not the best time to try to unpack in that moment, right? And in situations like that, what I encourage is, if there's some problem or thing, resolve the current, and then you might go back and revisit. However, if it is a time where something is happening and it comes up, and it's for lack of a better word, it's calm, it's peaceful, it's a time where it's like, hey, this is a perfect time, because in the moment, being able to give feedback in the moment is always great, because it's like, hey, it's happening right now.
Right.
When I'm working with families therapeutically, oftentimes they'll identify situations and things that have happened, right? And then what we do is we say, okay, we're talking about it. And I say, hey, we're giving you permission the next time that thing is happening to say, like, hey, it's one of those times, like, this is what we've been talking about. So then we can unpack it in the moment, right? That doesn't always work, though. That doesn't always work. The other thing I would say when I say it's layered is, if there's something you want to address, is that if I'm bringing something to you, if I'm coming to you and saying, hey, I have a problem with, or I want to talk about this, that is not the greatest time typically to say, well, this is what you do, right? Because
Right.
you are, it's almost like you're negating what that person. So listen, receive that feedback, right? Address that in that moment, right? Unpack that in that moment. And then, pick a different time to then address if there's something else. Or even after that, like, great, I'm so glad you brought that up. Address what they're bringing to you and say, and I'm so glad you brought that up. Can we also talk about this? But make sure you're addressing the concern that if a person's bringing something to you in that moment. And so it's kind of like a both and, right? It's learning to be aware of the moment. It's learning to be aware, like, is this the best time? Because when you're in the midst of an argument with someone, that's not the best time to go pull out the war chest and say, well, now I have a whole list of things that I would like to address with you.
Right.
It's not typically going to be well received.
Wow. Wow. That's great information. Roslyn, I hope that answered your question. And it sounds like it's such a complex thing because there's so many different situations. There's different experiences that have occurred up to that point. I even think about in my particular setting as a speech language pathologist, sometimes parents or caregivers of adults may ask, okay, so how do I address this situation? Or do I step in at this time? How do I know when to, take the lead? And it's such a, it's a very individualized conversation to have because you want to make sure you're assessing the full scope and the full picture from a perspective of how can I be of support and what is most beneficial for that person in that moment at that time. So I love that, you offered such great insight as to the best ways to navigate from a perspective of what generally can work. But that leads me into the next part of what I wanted to say. I was thinking out people's thoughts, stigma, if you will, when it comes to mental health or getting support for mental health. We may have these different labels or names or diagnoses that we often assign to a reasoning for why we should seek out support. But can you help give the audience more perspective as to what other areas also warrant opportunities to seek out professional support or professional help from a mental health perspective?
Absolutely. So shifting the public conversation around mental health to it being a conversation of mental wellness, a conversation of mental hygiene, right? So when you think about what hygiene is and what hygiene means, think about personal hygiene, right? So if you think about personal hygiene, those are the things that we do on a daily basis to make sure and to increase our general health and wellness. When you even think about personal hygiene as a movement, it was probably maybe even only 100 years ago that we started having a conversation about personal hygiene.
Got it.
And when that conversation was introduced in the public, and we started doing things like washing our hands, bathing, just brushing your teeth, and that when personal hygiene was introduced, it took some years, but what we saw was about a 50% increase in mortality when we started personal hygiene. So just imagine if we apply the same concept to our mental hygiene, which we don't do. Mental health is treated differently than the other parts of like our physical health, our oral health. And those are things that we attend to, not just because something is wrong, but as a preventative measure, right? We go to the doctor and have a yearly checkup. We go to the dentist, we get our teeth cleaned. And then we also do things in between to make sure that we stay healthy and fit until the next time that we have that visit. And we do not have the same attention to our mental health. Mental health, is, as you said, has a stigma associated with it, that only when something is wrong, that then I seek out help and assistance. And so from that same perspective of, if it becomes a regular part of the conversation, it becomes a regular part of, hey, I want to do a check-in. I want to establish a relationship in a space as it relates to my mental health so that I can make sure that I'm staying mentally well and that I can get the tools and understand the things I need to do to maintain my mental hygiene. Then that becomes a different conversation, right? And
Absolutely.
so if we think about that, in the same other areas, there are times when there's something going on with the individual that it is beyond just regular check-ins and checkups, because sometimes it is because of an unhealthy lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's genetics and hereditary, and we see the expression of something. Same thing with mental health. And the best way, the reason that we do checkups and wellness in other spaces is because if there is, or the potential for something to show up or manifest, early intervention is the best opportunity to do something about it. Same thing with your mental health, right?
Yes. Yes.
Having some regular hygiene is what's going to, us pay attention, be like, okay, you know what? I am hearing something here. I am hearing, like, I have a concern about how you're managing this, and it allows us to intervene early. And what we know about anything, early intervention is going to give us the best prognosis.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love that you brought that piece up, because in our field as well, for speech pathology, early intervention is something we absolutely promote, absolutely encourage. And you do see outcomes that are consistent with those who were able to take advantage of that opportunity, and how it shows up differently for maybe the opportunity having not been taken advantage of. And I love that you shifted the perspective from a place of maintenance, wellness, hygiene. So it takes the thought about, well, my situation is not as bad as so-and-so's, or, well, I've been dealing with it in this way this long, so I'm okay, or this is the way we've always done it. So I love that you shifted it from a perspective of just trauma perspective versus, and that's very relevant as well, but the perspective from the layperson knowing, hey, it's just a hygiene, wellness, check-in, making sure, checking out, being clear on where you stand, where you are in that particular arena. So thank you for offering that perspective. I think that is so beneficial for the audience to hear and better understand. And, I love that we've been able to have this very in-depth conversation. I certainly don't want it to be the last, but I did want to make sure I give the audience an opportunity to know how to reach you, should they want to have a mental health check-in or checkup, or just maintain their wellness and overall hygiene. So could you tell us how to reach you, the best place to contact you?
Yes, absolutely. So my practice is Akoma, Akoma, Counseling and Consulting. We are located in the downtown Decatur area. Our phone number is, I so frequently don't dial it myself, 404-378-7310.
Got it. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Thank you, Makini, for sharing your expertise, your insight. It's been such a rich conversation. And again, certainly don't want it to be the last. Those of you who are watching, those of you who will jump back into the replay, please take advantage of the resources available to you through Makini's private practice. Also, take advantage of some of the information that was shared today. There was so much value in what was shared, so much offered as to how to approach these conversations differently. And if you want to continue to stay connected to us, which I hope you will, please go to word-equity.com. Find me on Instagram at dom.knd. I'm here on Facebook at Dominique KND. Would love to hear from you and love for you to continue to join these conversations. Thank you so much. And again, thank you, Makini, for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Awesome. You guys have a great one. Bye-bye.